Hello, this talk is called The Developmental Model of Intelligence Offloading. I'm Bradley Alisea, and I'm presenting on behalf of my co-authors Jesse Parent and Angela Resius. So to start off, we want to go back to Andy Clark's work on embodied cognition. And one of the examples that he gives is the bluefin dolphin. And this is where the bluefin dolphin is swimming through a water column, and their muscles do not have the power it needs to move, and so they utilize these vortices in the environment to improve their swimming capacity. This creates a feedback loop between sensory motor control and the sensory environment. And so the question we're asking is, how does this get selected for in evolution and expressed more explicitly in development? So to understand this a little bit better, we're going to draw from the world of agents. And this is a picture of an Animat, which is a biologically inspired type of agent. And we have this model of the agent phenotype. So we have this embodied agent, and they interact with the model of the environment, which includes affordances. There's also a model of innateness that informs what the phenotype will look like a priori. And then there's feedback from the environment, which shapes what that phenotype looks like. And so you can see here we have different stages of development in a developmental Bradenburg vehicle, going from this trypoblastic precursor to an adult form. We also want to draw from the distinction between disembodied neural networks and these developmental Bradenburg vehicles. So neural networks in their disembodied form must consume high levels of energy and information as compared to biological brains. And the developmental approach will help us to overcome some of those constraints. This leads us to this developmental trade-offs model. In a trade-off model, you have an energetic investment in development in what will be expressed in development. And so you have this energetic budget. You have a rate of brain growth that's sort of a baseline rate, and a rate of information acquisition that's required to interact with the environment. This energetic budget, these requirements that come a priori, then get invested in different ways. It gets invested in brain size and internal representation. It gets invested in offloading, which come in the form of direct perception and affordances, and something called stigmergy, which is social interaction based. And so these affordances may require some energy, but maybe not as much as developing an internal brain. And then we also have to remember that in the case of an embodied agent, the body also has sort of an offloading capacity, as the peripheral motor system, for example, can function like a statistical prior and an information prefilter. We can also draw from the work of Susan Oyama, who was the founder of developmental systems theory. And remember that ontogeny is developmental history. And as you can see here at the left, this diagram, there are various pathways that arise out of this innateness, and they're based on the organism's interactions with the environment. And developmental systems theory puts that in a deeper context in saying that the information in the genome is expressed as alternate developmental pathways. Finally, we can draw from proximal development and emergence, which is sort of the regulatory role of the social milieu. We can look at two different ways of problem solving in agents. The first is independent problem solving, where they just simply take a differential approach between their brains and the environment. But agents can also plug into a social network, which allows them access to the differential capability of as many neighbors as they're connected to, while each individual benefits within their local environment and the brains that they possess. There are these collective behaviors such as stigmergy, which can emerge that can encode things in the environment. So going back to developmental trade-offs, why do we have internal representations? And so there are a number of theories that I've listed here that sort of try to explain why we have internal representations, ranging from the idea that internal representations are trivial to the idea that they create this sort of alternate reality that improves our fitness. But there are a couple of other papers that kind of get into this in the context of growing brains and why brains are scaled differently based on the needs of the organism and their internal representation. So the first is this paper on shrunken social brains, and it argues for a minimal model for the role of social interaction and neural complexity. And they say that smaller brain agents must increase their neural complexity to enhance their ability to engage in social complexity. So organisms or agents that have more social partners in that social network will have larger brains. In this case, larger brain mammals live longer. The argument is that the brain size is connected intimately to the longevity and also the developmental length of organisms. And so this has maybe some innate basis. And so one way we can look at this in terms of our agents is something called heterochrony, which is a way to look at the rate of internal acquisition and the rate of brain growth. So brain growth occurs over developmental time as a function of growth and a function of acquisition. And so you can see that you can have this linear function that describes the growth of a brain area over time, and that it can be decelerated with a single parameter. And this can be affected by environment. It can be affected by modifying the internal model or the innate component of the agent. And so there's this simple parameter that we can adjust. And this also leads to this parameter can be plotted against offloading potential to describe the rate of internal acquisition. So the rate of acquisition for an internal model. But we also have to remember that there exists great heterogeneity in neural tissues that becomes apparent with this expansion and increasing complexity. And this is something we don't see in artificial neural networks too much. But this is something to keep in mind to build more realistic agents. And so there are a number of ways in which the human brain varies in this way. Different cells use more energy than other cells. When they're connected into an array, some cells that don't use as much energy in their singular form then start to use more energy. And energy consumption for different functions within a neural cell, such as postsynaptic function and presynaptic function, vary between cell types. And so as developing agents explore their world, energy can be put into expanding neuronal tissue or finding ways of encoding information in the environment in the shape of affordances. And so, and again, we can go back to how sort of this power, this energy consumption trade-off works in human motor learning. So this paper talks about metabolic power consumption in human motor learning. And as it turns out that learning and using these arrays and using the environment to learn things reduces the cost of energy. So sometimes there's an energetic cost to not being plastic. So plasticity also plays a role here. We also can see another example of this in primate fovea, where the anatomical structure of the fovea varies in terms of how it makes function more efficient. And so those are all things that we have to think about when we think about agent design and these trade-offs. And so we can see that heterochrony not only exists as this simple function, but it can also be sequential. And so in this case, we have sequence heterochrony, which is where we have things that are expressed at different points in development, and they have to occur in a certain order, and they contribute to sort of the building of complexity in that agent. So here we have the sequence of events A through E, and there's this buildup of complexity, but if they're taken out of order in the innate component of the agent, you have this nonlinear sequence, and you have this disrupted development. And so the reason I point this out is because we can then take our agent and put it into behavioral contexts such as spatial cognition. And so in viewpoint networks and proximal development, which we'll talk about here, we use the example of mental rotation, which is the development of brains and their interface with the environment. This is where they have to make sense of shapes and apparent motion in different orientations on this alien planet. And here's a viewpoint network with different agents, and they're developing and they're taking in information from different viewpoints of this geometric structure. They're developing mental rotation skills on their own. It's encoded in their nervous system, but they have to gain information from the environment to put everything together. They can share information with their neighbors, and they have this innate capacity. And you can see that when they're sharing information with their neighbors, the order of how the complexity of their brains grow and the sort of the pace and tempo of their development is very important. And acquiring these images, you can see that the agents will take a viewpoint or a slice of a complex geometry, and this must create a uniform mental representation that they can either use for themselves or share with their neighbors. This also allows, sometimes in some cases like this environment, you can use landmarks such as this tower in this image to align yourself. And so you can make sense of a lot of different forms of information coming from your neighbors, coming from the environment, and coming from your internal model, which is shaped by your innate capabilities. So the innate component may dictate a degree of spatial rotation and navigational skills. So this may, you might be able to observe differences if you have differences in the innate component, differences between agents, or look at the agents in terms of their fitness in this way. And so affordances and landmarks can still aid in performance, even if that's the case. And this has to do with this affects this rate of information acquisition that we talked about. Finally, you can look at the developmental learning of celestial navigation, where multiple agents observe celestial movements, and you can see star positions and landscape markers that are used as affordances. So there are a number of ways to train agents, and using offloading and things that are analogous to what humans do. Humans have done for centuries in terms of celestial navigation, using landmarks to align themselves both socially and looking at things in the environment. And with agents, we can look at this in terms of their development, in terms of their innateness, and in terms of how those things come together in development. So thank you for your attention. And if you're interested in our Computational Critical Periods Discord, where we discuss critical periods from a computational standpoint, critical periods are these important periods of development, there's the link. And thank you for your attention.